No,
It's usually
am I
me who's
frozen
the
for you,
trouble.
Maya?
Oh, you just froze for a second. It's all good.
Okay. Sometimes the video freezes for me for people, but not the audio, so I feel like. But
Okay.
yeah, so we were discussing it again. We picked up in the middle, and for about 20-25 minutes, none of us had our recorder on.
Oh no! Oh,
Yeah, it was kind of crazy.
frustrating.
Let me turn down this bandwidth a little bit. I'm getting such high bandwidth that you guys are freezing just a little bit. Okay, we are live. 3, 2, 1. You ready?
I've started.
Okay.
Oh, you mean you want me to
Okay.
say? Okay, here we go.
It's okay. Okay, I'm going to count to 5. Go for it.
This is Literary Roadhouse. One short story, once a week. I'm Ros Morris.
I'm Anais.
And I'm Maya. Gerald is still on vacation.
And what a vacation. He's recently been updating with pictures on all social media, and he's in southern France, cycling through vineyards and picking potatoes as a form of cultural tourism, and I want his life.
Who knew Gerald was that cool? Well, in exchange for Gerald being gone, if you've been around, you know that we've had some awesome guests filling in, and today's guest host is no different. Today we have Ros Morris. She's pretty awesome. She's an author, editor, speaker, and coach. After being a successful ghostwriter, selling over 4 million copies, she's now publishing under her own name. Right now she has 2 novels, including My Memories of a Future Life and Lifeform 3, in addition to several nonfiction works focusing on writing. It's great to have you, Ros. Welcome to the show.
Oh,
How are
thanks
you
so
doing
much.
today?
Oh, I'm doing great, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is going to be such fun.
Oh, totally. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with reading.
Oh well, it's always been something I absolutely adore to do, and I'm a really slow reader because I get trapped by a sentence, and I will always want to go over and over it again and find out why it had the power that it had. And it might be anything, the shape of the words on the page, or just the fall of the syllables, anything like that. So I adore reading, but I'm a very slow reader, which is a pity because I also buy a lot of books. The room I'm in at the moment is just, we don't need any kinds of pictures on the walls because we have bookshelves, and all our house is like this. My study is the fiction room. And well, the fiction
I
room that will
love
fit in.
it. I'm a slow reader too, and it's something I've always been a little self-conscious about because I started out as a really fast reader, and after college I became a much slower reader, and now that I'm writing, I'm even slower because, like you said, I'm always analyzing stuff as I go. So what kind of reading do you normally focus on?
All sorts of things. It's mostly dictated by whatever I'm working on. Basically, my novels rule my life. They rule the things I become interested in, and an idea grabs hold of me. And in fact, it stays with me for many years because I'm not only a slow reader, I'm a kind of slow developer of books. My novels take me a long time because I need to kind of work out what they should be. And that involves a lot of just reading. I become interested in things I wouldn't have read about before, and so I might read a lot of things, a lot of fiction, a lot of non-fiction. But recently, I've been enjoying Hilary Mantel. I love what she did by wriggling inside Tudor England and the characters there. And a friend has just given me an advanced reader's copy of Andrew Miller's latest novel, The Crossing, and I'm really enjoying that. And I feel very privileged because nobody else has read it, and I've got it.
Just a
That must be
second.
exciting. Oh,
Oh, I just froze a little bit. Keep going. I can
oh yeah,
cut that.
I was gonna say that must be a really exciting feeling because so I do a little bit of editing as well. It feels a little premature to call myself an editor just yet, but I get that same feeling sometimes when I'm reading a manuscript and I'm like, oh, nobody knows that this happens but me and the author and maybe their husband or wife. So there's this sort of feeling of like voyeurism, I guess, that comes a part of it. But I'm also a slow reader, and then I'm self-conscious. I'm like, I'm an editor and a slow reader. I mean, I can't. how am I going to finish all these books?
Oh, yeah, yes. And it's the same if I'm working on somebody's manuscript. It takes me a while because I cannot read fast. And also, I notice so much, and I think this is another reason why I read slowly. Maya, you said that your reading speed changed once you've done your degree. And do you think that's because you were noticing more? Is this what makes us slow readers?
I think originally it changed because I was reading a lot of nonfiction for school, which is a different type of reading. I was reading a lot of scientific journals, and so I got away from reading fiction for about 10 years. And then when I went back to reading fiction, I was just slow out of practice. But as I started reading more and I was writing more, I did start to notice more, and I became an annotator. I started doing a lot of marginalia that I never used to do. A lot of rereading of paragraphs, sometimes reading paragraphs out loud to hear the rhythm, and it all slowed me down to like a screeching halt. And so now I've got this, like you, I've got this huge list of books I want to read. I want to get them read before I go for my MFA, but at the same time, I'm so slow. I'm like, am I ever going to get through this book that needs to be read? Yeah. It happens. It definitely happens.
Yeah,
so what are we going to do today, Anais?
Well, today we're going to discuss The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. Listeners should know that sometimes we get a little saucy in our discussions, so if we do slip into potty mouth, we'll let you know in the show notes and slap an explicit label on those episodes in iTunes. Listeners with children should share their episodes at their discretion.
Okay, so this is your warning. If you haven't read Masque of the Red Death yet and you don't want to be spoiled, pause the podcast, read the story, and then come back. So, Masque of the Red Death is a story by Edgar Allan Poe, as we all know. This was my first Edgar Allan Poe story. In this story, there are people that are dying of the Red Death in this town, and the prince decides that he is going to gather everybody together in a nice safe space that he owns. I guess it's like part of his palace, in order to avoid the Red Death, and he holds parties and everything there, and no one's allowed to leave. But then in comes this being that is wrapped like a dead person, and he's covered in blood, and they think it's somebody making a game, you know, because they're having this masquerade party, so it's somebody in costume. They're all offended by it, but it turns out that he looks at him, he gets too close and dies, and then pretty much everybody in the building dies. That is a quick summary. Of course, there's a lot more to it, but we'll get into it in the discussion. So, first off, top level, how did everybody feel about the story? Just basic level.
Shall I start? I can go first. Okay. I felt it was like a dream or stage set or a ballet. There's something about it that's very theatrical. It's full of bold colours and very sonorous language. It talks about the dull, heavy, monotonous clang of the clock, and it's incredibly sensory and vivid. I felt it had this quality of a dream. It's like an experience where you're not quite sure what it is, but you just go along. Mm-hmm. There's all this strange stuff. It's very much about fear, isn't it? Because you've got this disease that's very fast. It's not something that people have time to think about. They don't even have a few hours. It kills in half an hour. Half an hour after you get it, you're dead. And so there's no time to get used to it or accept or come to terms with it. So it's very exaggerated. Everything's very exaggerated. In fact, that I was looking it up online a bit, and there were people who were trying to work out what the disease might have been. And it's faster even than the Black Death, and that was a pretty fast disease. I don't know how fast Ebola is, but I don't know if they had that then. But the speed of the disease is important because it doesn't give you any time. It's just, that's it. And so it's about the dread of it rather than the actual thing itself. So it's about trying to shut out something that you fear, but it keeps creeping back because you've got the figure that comes in, you've got the clock, you've got the fact that all the windows in this place although they're sort of, they've got colours and things behind them, they all look inwards. They don't look outwards. There's nobody dares look out.
Yeah,
But
it's a very interesting story. For me, as I read it, I felt tight as I was reading it, and the clock ticking was a very like potent symbol. I could almost feel it ticking in like my heartbeat as I was reading the story. It's an older story. When was it written? 1842. And this story really brought to mind the difference between modern writing and older writing. I read a lot of classics, but I've been on this modern literary fiction kick for a while because I felt like I was lacking in modern fiction. And it's been a while since I read something from the mid 1800s, and it was a very different reading experience. I almost had to stop, go back, and start over, because if I read it as a modern reader, I wasn't enjoying it. But once I stopped and went back and allowed myself to savor the language, I enjoy this story a lot more. How about you, Anais? How did you initially feel about the story?
Kind of like Roz, I was really taken with the setting of it. The comments that I put next to sort of setting are like such great pageantry, dark pageantry, and it's kind of cinematic. Even though I agree that the language, it has that sort of like hypotaxis, very kind of complicated, verbose thing that was in vogue at the time. Despite that, the image that was being painted in my mind, possibly because I'm reading this in 2015, was very much like, I felt
Like a
like it was
play.
like, yeah, like a play, or like somebody. I felt like like the Prince Prospero, the prince, like he's like a set designer, like he's working with light and he's putting in like velvet drapings and everything, kind of like a little crazy. And that part of it felt oddly modern, but it could also be what I'm bringing to the table, as we've discovered sort of with recent stories. But I liked it overall. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you both mention the set design because it is the story. Like, a lot of people might read this and think, oh, he's focusing too much on the set, but the set is the story. And I found that really interesting because it's not something you see anymore, really. And the detail that it was done, like every room has a different color. And as you get closer and closer to the red room, with the black walls and the red glass, like that's the only room where the glass doesn't match the walls. And I could picture how the fire on the opposite side of the window that shines through the windows, in all these different rooms, it reflects all these beautiful colors, but in this room where it's black and red, how ominous that would actually feel and look. It was really intense in that respect, and I enjoyed that a lot. The description of the guy when he comes in that everyone's creeped out by, and then, the prince says, get him, and no one will go close to him at all. Like, that was like, whoa. I totally thought that was like the Grim Reaper, and I liked how they called it a mummy or a mummer. I guess that's what they called mummies back in the day. And then when they unwrapped him, there was nothing there. That was just, whoa.
Yeah, I actually liked the setting and the atmosphere, and indeed the set, more than the point where the Red Death figure started moving around. It's like I felt the setup was so powerful, and I think that did more work for me than the action sort of in that last part of the book, and I think that was working more on me. And that's the way Gothic fiction works anyway, isn't it? You've got hidden rooms and things being shut away and ignored, and strange sounds that stop everything, and then everyone carries on and tries to ignore it. And that I felt was the human heart of the story.
I've never read a lot of Gothic fiction. Have you read Gothic fiction before, Anais?
I can't really say that I have. I mean, probably in school, a short story here or there, but sort of like chosen it on my own. Not really. But what Roz was just saying, talking about that the setting seemed to do more for her, and I feel like the setting had all the stuff to dig out of it. Like when I was reading it, it made me think of the All the World's a Stage monologue from Shakespeare's As You Like It, where he talks about the 7 stages of man being 7 acts, and he has the 7 rooms from east to west, like the arc of the sun, like all of that, where it's just like, and the last one, the westernmost room, is the death room, where the final like murder happens. Like the first time I read it, I was like, okay, I got the east to west thing right away, but I didn't quite get the 7 stages of man part, even though that's come up. It's not just Shakespeare. I think it predates Shakespeare.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
pretty common motif.
yeah, and 7 in general and numerology and mysticism comes up all the time. So it seems like all the Easter eggs in this story are in the setting itself, because then when you take down sort of like the plot and the theme, there aren't that many Easter eggs. It's almost kind of disappointing. Not disappointing, but it's just like the set is where everything is at for me, and I guess for
Hmm.
Ross as well.
So if the set was such a huge point of the story, what do you guys think the set is representing?
Um, Before we stop talking about the set, can I just say I would love to see this as an installation. That's what it
Oh,
feels
that would be
like.
cool. That would be really cool.
Because it's the experience of being in there and the atmosphere of the clock stopping everything. And I love the device of the clock as well, because the clock, I mean, time is very cleverly woven into this narrative. Because you're aware of the clock ticking away and how many seconds there are in an hour and all that, and the clock becomes, it stops everything, it stops all the revelry, and it strikes 1, then it strikes 2 and takes up a little bit more of their attention, and then by the time it strikes midnight it's taking up quite a lot and it's disturbing them a lot. And I mean, I just think that's so atmospheric. But okay, now you asked a question. What was it again?
No, but that's great, because in LA there's this new thing where there's like these puzzles where people pay to go into this room that has like a theme, and the idea is to try to get out. And I could totally see this done as that type of art installation environment, and it would be pretty awesome. My question was, since the environment is such a huge part of this story, I think we've all agreed that the actual story is the environment. There isn't a whole lot that happens. It's not character driven really. There's not a lot of really strong characters to latch onto. So it really is about the environment. And so my question is, what does the environment represent? This is something I was tossing out of my head, where I was like, what is he trying to say here? What was the author's intention? What am I getting from the story? And I'm just curious what you guys think on that.
Well, an obvious interpretation is it's about denial or return of the repressed or death. I was chatting to my husband about it, and he said it could be about the loss of youth, even growing up. It's one of those metaphors that will do for quite a lot of things, isn't it?
Yeah.
It could be death, or it could be any change, anything that we're trying to deny and push away, but it's not going to go away because time is ticking on.
How about for you, Anais?
Yeah, I think the setting kind of helps the theme, which I guess we'll talk about a little bit later, but it's sort of like that idea that you can't escape death. So you have this sort of tableau of life, like if you're going with the 7 rooms being the 7 stages of man, the arc from east to west, when you have all of that going on, it's a little bit of like, that is fixed. Those rooms aren't going to move. The people move, and they avoid the death room because it's freaky and it's scary. But at the end of the day, they all rush towards it, because I think that's very powerful. Like, the death doesn't come and kill them all in the eastern room or in the green room.
No, they go towards it.
Yeah, and not only that, but he just walks towards death. He does this sort of march towards it. He doesn't drag them there against their will. He goes there, and they all gravitate there because it's inevitable. That's how it's going to happen, just from his presence. So I think that sort of helps that theme of like, you can't escape death even in a castle with a crazy prince.
Yeah, I definitely saw, the idea of the environment being a metaphor for life itself. You enter, and then there's all these various rooms, and then there's this huge party, but in the end, you do have to go towards death. It's natural, and it's what's going to happen. And the exploration of the fear of it, how many people have like such a terrifying fear of death. To me, that seemed perhaps the more obvious metaphor, and I almost thought, well, maybe it's too obvious. Maybe there's something deeper there. But at the same time, it's so there, And I don't know if it's that potent for me because I'm coming at it from 2015 or because I'm a Buddhist. I don't know if that's why it's dragging that meaning out for me. But when I read this story, I definitely felt like this was a metaphor for life and the movement towards death and the fear of death.
I almost feel it didn't need the second half. and I don't know if that's me thinking as a writer, because also as a writer I'm the kind of person who likes things more for what they awaken me than what the writer might have intended. That's just the kind of the way that I think. But that's why I was saying that I enjoyed it up until the point they start to confront the figure. I didn't enjoy it from there so much. I thought, oh yes, okay, they've got to wrap it up and do something, haven't they? But really, they've already done the best, which is to create this feeling. And I think it's the feeling that's most interesting to me. But maybe that's also because I'm reading it in 2015, and that's just how our minds have gone.
I think so. I think we're much more, I mean, we've talked a couple times about the essay I read by Zadie Smith about the Barths versus Novakovian readers. And, the second half of the story, I felt like, for me, it was important. I felt like if it had stopped before that and it hadn't culminated in everyone's death, it wouldn't have gone the full circle. Like life is a circle, and this story really is a circle. It begins with the death of people outside the castle, and it ends with the death of the people inside the castle. And I feel like if it had ended at the first half, I would have lost something. But at the same time, I get that the second half of the story feels almost like a different story. It's much more intense, and it's faster paced in a way that the beginning of the story isn't. The beginning of the story felt very slow and methodical and kind of dragging you in slowly, and the second half of the story felt almost more modern in, the pace sped up, and there was more action happening, and then the people are running, and so it felt different. There was like this cusp that it had to cross in order to get to that end of the circle.
Or I have a theory. I wonder if also part of, because I understand what Roz is saying. We're sort of like the second half, it's not doing as much, and I wonder if it's because it's kind of a foregone conclusion for us. Like, okay, obviously, like now everybody has to die. Like that's what we've been building towards to a certain. And I wonder if it's because in this day and age we consume so many stories. Even people who aren't readers watch movies and TV shows and listen to stories in the news all the time. I wonder if maybe like the modern day reader is really good at sussing out like, and this is how it has to end. So like, because we hear so many of them, right? Because if they didn't all die, then it's almost kind of like, okay,
what's the point?
Yeah. Well, all right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Good point. Yes.
I think to add to that, Anais, I mean, this was a very influential writer. So anyone that grew up in the 80s and 90s and read or watched any older horror, there's so much influence from Edgar Allan Poe in that particular generation of horror, both novels and TV, that a lot of this felt familiar, and if we were in 1841, this would probably feel very fresh and very new. And so for us, we've been used to reading the reflections of this, and now we're reading the base material.
Yeah, we're reading the daddy of it.
Do you guys think that ruins it in some ways? Like, I've had this experience with other books where, like, I've read somebody and then I go back and I read who influenced them, and it's a very different experience for me because I've read this other person for so long.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because it's already been developed further. And something that I found difficult coming to this story was the fact that it was famous, so it's difficult to be surprised. We don't have the surprise that the original readers would have had.
That is so true. Even me, never having read Edgar Allan Poe, really not knowing anything about this particular story, I've spent a couple weeks binge watching The Following, which is about a group of serial killers forming a cult based on Edgar Allan Poe, and it did. There was nothing that was a surprise to me. And at first I almost felt let down, but then I realized it's because I've just been hitting myself with this material, and I was reading the base material.
Yeah, and actually I was just thinking as we said that, there was one sort of surprise that occurred to me was more about Edgar Allan Poe himself. So I read it, and at the end I'm like, wait a minute, there's like no moral here. There's no story of comeuppance, and I thought there would be because earlier on when
Anais?
all the when
Oh,
all the
you
knights
froze for a second. Oh. Okay, can you turn down your bandwidth a little bit?
turn down my bandwidth? You mean
Yeah, yeah.
Turn off the video?
Or just turn it down so that you're pixelated. I can cut this out. It's the little one that looks like a volume button, but it's not a volume.
I'll just have a drink of water then.
I have the screen.
Top, next to the camera,
Mm-hmm.
looks like a volume.
How's
yeah,
this?
if you just turn that down a little bit.
Yeah, I have it in the middle now.
Okay, now you can continue what you're saying. Sorry about that, Anais.
No problem. So, one thing that sort of surprised me was that there was no moral here. For some reason, I had this idea that older stories like had morals, and then when I looked up Edgar Allan Poe, he rejected that. He didn't want things that were didactic. He wanted just the effect of stories without the morals. But I almost thought there would be a moral because initially in the story, when they all lock themselves up in the abbey, there's that line where it says, the external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. I'm like, haha, they're totally going to get their comeuppance now because they don't care about all the poor people outside the castle. And that never happens. And I think that was more of a surprise. I'm like, oh, okay. Like, they never...
I love that. I love that. Yeah, that didn't even, like, I didn't even notice that, but you're so right. There really wasn't.
Yeah, they die like everybody else.
But it was like, it'll get them in the end. I think that was the point of that.
But it'll get everybody.
Yeah, they suffer the
yeah,
same
it'll get everybody, no escape.
Yeah, except they had a really nice last 6 months.
Yeah,
exactly.
But also, here's something. They were in there for 6 months. They were fine for 6 months, and that's quite interesting. That it carried on and on and on. But the creeping unease didn't really start until they just got too cocky and they had this ball.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the Red Death went in there because he had already wasted everybody outside the castle and there was nobody left to waste, and he just had to get in there and take care of what was left?
I don't know if we're even meant to wonder about that. Actually, it was there. You know, it happened.
Because my whole thing was, why is it taking 6 months?
I got it.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. Busy.
Oh, you got your mom's theory, Annie. Is this your mother's theory?
I'm channeling my mom right now. The story within a story. There wasn't really a ball. The Red Death had already gotten into the castle. What we're seeing is the dream of Prince Prospero as he's dying, his final dream before death. Which, when you think about it, kind of makes sense. Because, like, is the Red Death just hanging around waiting for the perfect allegorical setting to life to make his move? Like, I need to wait until they have a ball that perfectly represents life. Unless it's a fevered dream of a dying man who is already infected.
I think I need to ban you from reading your mother's post.
There is a bit about dreams, and I liked it because it was quite strange and vague. Because you can't tell what the dreams are; they just writhe about.
Yeah.
So who knows? But I liked that. I like that because where everything else is quite precise, that's not.
Mm-hmm.
So there are things that can't be named, the things that can't be described. So who knows? Maybe it's somebody's fever dream.
Annie, you just ruined me. Now, I mean, every time I look at this story, I'm gonna see it as a dream.
It was all a dream.
Like, that's how I'm going to see it. Because you've just totally put that in my head, and it does fit. It does kind of fit.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And there's also that line where it's like, you might think Prince Prospero is mad, but he's not mad. His dancers know he's not crazy. I'm like, yeah, in your dreams, he sounds crazy. Like, in his dreams, he's not crazy.
He's got a bit of a silly name, hasn't he? So he does deserve to die because he's called something silly.
Yeah.
Where else have I heard the name Prince Prospero? That name sounds familiar.
Well, apart from the Tempest.
Used.
But he wasn't.
Oh, that's what it was. The Tempest. Thank you, because that was nagging at me. I was like, I know this name. Where is it coming from? But you're right, the Tempest. Mm-hmm. I wonder.
But he does live to old age, and this prince, he sort of
does not
quite quickly.
Yeah, he's offed quite quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So So, what was there anything else about the story that you felt was really interesting or really positive before we start getting into the things that we didn't like?
Consulting notes.
That's okay. I'm over here looking at my little red lines.
I sort of have one off the top of my head. I remember being a little surprised when he's describing the dancing as like kind of like writhing, and it was kind of like everything seemed like a euphemism for like a really kind of sexual revelry, which I was a little surprised at given the year. I was like, oh, is this one of those? Because I think everyone's just kind of boning.
That didn't occur to me.
Well, it didn't occur to me either, but now that you say that, a lot of religions are very anti-dancing for that reason. They consider dancing to be very sexual. And there's been a lot of churches that have split along that line. You know, when you look at the Black Baptist Church, there's, you know, one branch that dances and one branch that doesn't. You know, and if you take the monks' vows, like the additional precepts in Buddhism, one of the precepts is to refrain from dancing and listening to music because it brings out that lustful energy. And so, you know, describing it as writhing feels very apropos. You know, I've been at dances where people were just dancing, but it really didn't feel like people were just dancing.
And also when he describes the costumes, like the final description is like, and not a little, and they excite disgust basically. Like I'm like, okay.
And you know what? In order to do this, it's such an elaborate. I mean, it's one thing to be rich, but it's another thing to pack a hall, provide enough food for all your entourage for 6 months, provide costumes, entertainment, bands, decorations. Like, literally, he moved the entire court and all of its accoutrements into this hall. And that says something about both his prosperity, hence Prospero, and also, you know, his foresight. Like, you know, he's intent to hold up until this thing is completely over. You know, and that was just, I was kind of like, whoa.
Something that I really liked was the language, and I've got this paragraph in front of me, and I don't know how long it's going to take to read it out. I'll read out bits of it. But it was where it starts to introduce the clock of ebony, and the sentence, the word order in the sentences is beautifully judged, because you've got the hour, was it? And the hour was to be stricken. There came from the brazen lungs of the clock, wow, a sound that was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour, how long is this sentence? But it still works. The musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound. And now that's a semicolon. We still haven't finished, but it's beautifully done. It's beautifully judged, and it has this sonorous quality. And it was a pleasure to read this story.
It really was. And as a modern reader, it forced me to slow down and just enjoy the journey, which a lot of times, like when we read Hemingway, it felt very fast. You know, it was very clipped and you were done. You know, and this story, even though it's such a short story, it's really short, it slowed me down because of the way the language was used. Mm-hmm. You know, there was one thing that I liked, the juxtaposition of the grotesque and the glittery glare and poignancy, like in everything, there's like, throughout the story, he's constantly comparing, you know, the opposites. And I enjoyed that quite a bit, you know, the opposites of the colors, the opposites of, you know, when they're dancing, and, you know, sure, they're grotesque, but then there's all this, you know, glittery and beautiful decorations and everything, you know, and everyone's happy, and then this creature comes in and everyone's freaked out. You know, it's constantly opposites throughout the story. And I'm not sure how to explain it. It was just this feeling as I was reading it, you know, that it was constantly making me kind of seesaw through the story, which I enjoyed quite a bit. Now, as for what we didn't like about the story, anything in particular stand out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good segue, because actually, I think it's a bit strong to say I didn't like the language, but it definitely isn't my favorite writing style. So like, I mean, I can still understand it. He's still painting an image in my mind, and I understand it was in vogue at the time to write in this way. But there was just times where like I would read a certain phrase and I'm like, I know that's how people wrote back then, but I was just like, it just seems so unnecessary. Like there was this is like the final clause in a sentence that goes on for like ever, which is with such precautions the courtiers might bid defiance to the contagion. Like that just seems such an unnecessary clunky way to say that.
You're the type of editor that wants to steal all my semicolons, aren't you? You just rip them all out.
Semicolons, but it's sort of like yeah, there were, I mean, and it says something that probably one of my favorite lines was one of the shorter ones, which is when he's describing why the Red Death in particular, even though everyone at this masquerade is dressed kind of grotesquely, why he stood out. And there was that one line which was, there are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion, which I thought was a beautiful, simple way to say you just feel it in your heart that this is creepy. And you don't need 100 words and 1,000 clauses.
I like that though. The power of it, what you've picked up there is that it was short and it said, look, you just know this is bad.
Yeah. And you can identify with it. You know, you're like, oh, I know what that feels like when you just feel it in your gut or in your heart or in your chest that this is wrong, even though you can't see it. And I'm like, wow, what a beautiful way to express that.
This is also what's happening with the clock, because every time the clock strikes, they feel in their hearts it's wrong. And that's cutting through all the florid stuff, because it's very florid. You know, you've got the long sentences, elaborate stuff. You've got sentences with several adverbs, and then you have that simple thing, and that's like, you know, their hearts almost stop for a moment because this is real.
There are a couple instances where there are really short sentences that follow really long sentences, and I feel like the short sentences, because the preceding sentences are so long, they're almost like punctuation. And to me, the clock striking was very much like these short sentences being dropped in periodically, you know, because it was so long and so lavishly written as far as word usage, and then all of a sudden it would be, without was the Red Death, you know, just really simple, couple words, you know, and then you go further on, you know, and you have this big, huge, long paragraph that goes on and on forever. I'm like, when does the paragraph even end? But then again, you get long enough, and you'll see again, you know, something really short gets dropped in. I'm looking for it. I had underlined it, and now I can't see it. But yeah, I felt like the short sentences were more like punctuation. But I will say, Anais, at the beginning when I started reading this, I had to read the first paragraph twice because it was so long and kind of meandering, and I wasn't in that mindset when I was reading it. I don't know what I was expecting. You know, the father of horror. I'm like, I'm not sure what I'm expecting. And I went into this expecting a completely different writing style, and I had to go back and like read it twice. And I'm like, okay, great. Now I have to look up what saganaceous is. Isn't that blood? Like, you know, I felt a little ignorant. And then after I got into the mood of the writing, it was much more palatable, but at the same time, it did keep me kind of distant from the story. So I think I have to agree with you there that it did keep me distant from the story, but not because it wasn't beautiful. I think it's because I'm a modern reader and I'm so used to short sentences or even long sentences, but they're more interspersed, or maybe the grammar is a little less, I don't know, less elaborate. But as a reader, when I read this, I find them interesting. Like, some of these sentences, I'm like, how did he do that? Like, where's the verb? Where's the adverb? Like, this is interesting. You know, it's almost like a puzzle trying to figure out how he did it and how he created the emotion of the sentence. How about you, Roz? Was there anything in the story that you didn't like?
Well, I think I'd already started talking about that, preempting you, because I didn't know that we were going to get to this bit. But yeah, I started getting. I wasn't that keen on the action and the denouement, but I think it's because I thought the best had already been done. It was obvious that they were all going to have to die, and yeah, there was this figure, and Prince Prospero was quite irritating, but we're probably meant to think he's irritating because he's not as interesting as just the whole situation. The whole situation, it's a metaphor, and that's where I think it works really well. And eventually they're all killed. Yes, well, they are.
So if the problem with the second half of the story wasn't so much with the second half of the story, but more a case of the first half felt like it had already been done, that brings to question, like, what is the definition of story? Because we've been reading a lot of stories that don't fit the typical definition of story. You know, you've got your first act, second act, third act, beginning, middle, end, character, plot, like all these typical things that we read in modern stories, and we've been dabbling in a lot of stories lately that really don't fit those conventions, and it's really making me kind of push and ask myself, what is a story?
This is interesting because I recently wrote a book about plots, and for that I had to work out what all plots or all stories would have in common, even when they weren't following conventional structure. And I thought that they also have to have change of some kind. Things got to be different by the end. There's got to be a reason why they end where they do, why that is the end, or why that's the end of the glimpse you're seeing, even if they carry on afterwards in their lives. I think you've got to have crescendos as well. You've got to have, things build to a peak. So things start small and, amplify and magnify. And you've got to have struggles of some kind, because the struggle is the story.
Yeah. I like that definition. I wonder if maybe that's where my and Anais' problem with what we're aware of came from. Did you feel like there was a crescendo in that story, Anais?
There was, but you know how sometimes the reason why a story lets you down is because the crescendo is small? It can't just be a crescendo about anything. So the crescendo was, and they finally get to talk to the principal. And
that's not a crescendo.
That's the point. This is where it all comes together. They're going to find out what it is and have to deal with whatever that answer is. But it's just so small where you're just like, that's what we're building to, I think that's more like the disappointment. Because you can see, if you're plotting peaks, that's the peak, but it's not a very impressive one. It's like a hill.
Yeah, I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about all the stories. Here we are, this is our 19th episode. So we've read 19 stories and dissected them. And I'm trying to think, can I think of any stories that don't fit the definition that Roz just proposed? And I can't think of one. I think that's a really good definition. Even some of the weirder stories definitely had a crescendo. Magic Chalk, had a crescendo. Circular Ruins, definite crescendo. Yeah, I think that fits really well because these types of stories, you've heard me say before, I almost read it like poetry, but it's still a short story. What is that difference between poetry and short story, especially when you start talking about shorter and shorter stories?
And sometimes when we think of change, we think change must happen to the characters, but it might not. It might happen to the reader.
Yeah. Ooh. That's good. Ooh. Pardon me while that epiphany just knocks me on the head.
And you get that with poetry as well. By the end.
Yeah, you do.
You've had,
I remember reading Abortion by I. It's a very short poem. And literally at the end, I was just like, my mouth was hanging open. I was like, I can't believe I just read this. And it's one of these poems that literally decades later, it still pops up in my head periodically. It changed me as a person reading that poem. It changed me as a mother reading that poem. There's a line in that poem where the man says, because he's forgiven his wife, and he says, I've heard that that there are no children, that the poor have no children, and there's only room for one man in this house. And it's just like, whoa, and it changed me as a reader. And to count that as part of the crescendo kind of opens up the definition of short story quite a bit.
Was it Kurt Vonnegut who said, a story, it might be a story or a novel, but anyway, it's meditating in the mind of another.
Yeah, I like that.
sometimes that's what you get. Now, what's that poem you just mentioned? Because I'm going to have to write that down.
Oh, it's I. AI is the name of the poet, and the poem is I. It is abortion, and it's in her Vice collection. The collection is called Vice.
That sounds. I've got to check that out.
Yeah, her poetry is very just bam, raw, nothing left. It's just to the point, and it's very intense poetry. Okay, Anais. Is she frozen?
No, I don't think I have anything. No, I'm here.
I was just checking. Did we want to do any?
Describe stories. I agree.
We're just going off on like this total story tangent over here. We're like totally geeking out.
Yeah, I'm like, go for it. It sounds great.
Well, I mean, stuff like this is really interesting now that we've read so many stories. We're starting to get deeper into these stories. You know, I was not a short story reader coming into this project. And I feel like we're at the cusp of a new level of reading. You know, at the beginning, I felt like I was getting used to the form and I was exploring. And then I found myself developing tastes in the form. And I started reading short stories outside the podcast. And I found myself gravitating towards certain types of short stories. And now I'm definitely to a point where I'm starting to think, what are different types of themes? Like, I thought I knew what a theme was, but maybe I don't, you know, and I'm starting to explore these things a little deeper. And I think this was a really good conversation for me because this is a question I've had for quite a while.
What, the question about themes?
The question is about defining a short story, because we'd run into several short stories that I wondered, is this really a short story? You know, but when you open up the definition, then I can finally understand why they're considered short stories and not prose poems. Because they very much do change the reader, or there's a change in the environment. Maybe not in the character, but maybe in the environment or the mood. You know, and by opening that up, it allows me to read some of those short stories again in a different light, which I think will be really interesting. I have a project that some of the short stories that I've disliked the most, I want to reread them right around November, December of next year. Because by then we will have read 50 some odd short stories. And I'm very interested to see how I read them differently after having gone through 9-10 months of reading short stories intently. How about you, Annie? You're sitting there grinning.
No, yeah, I agree. And I'm actually thinking on all of our stories, and I think change and struggle is definitely a part of it. Even the ones that we said are more like portraits, because we kept saying that about The Cheater's Guide to Love. It's more like a portrait of a man, but there's still change and there's still struggle, right?
Yeah, all throughout it. All throughout. Definitely. Are we ready to rate the story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We give a rating based on 1 to 6 Bradburys. So for me, I'm going to give this a 4. I really enjoyed it, and it's prompting a lot of interesting questions to me. It's definitely something that I actually plan on doing more research on this story and really digging into it even deeper, because there's just a feeling in this story. There's a lot here, and I feel like this is a story that every time I read it, I'm probably going to see something different. But because I did feel so distant from the story, I really can't give it more than that yet. But I have a feeling that my relationship with the story may build over time. Who's going to go next?
I can go next. I'm going to give it a 4.5. I liked it. It's good. It made me think of World War Z, which is always great.
Now that was a description. That was a comparison I was not expecting.
Well, it's because in World War Z they talk about how castles are the perfect place to fortify yourself against zombies. I was like, all right, well, you know, it didn't quite work with the Red Death, but if it was zombies, it would have been fine. Well, yeah, 4.5. 5 just seems. It's not like I'm gonna run around telling people. I wouldn't recommend it to a lot of friends, not because I think it's bad, but just because it didn't. It's not something that I felt super, super close to me, even though I recognize that it is really well done and crafted.
Yeah, we do tend to be a little stingy on our ratings, so yeah, I totally feel you. How about you, Roz?
I'd also give it a 4. There's a lot that I liked about it.
That's surprising.
Well, I like, as I said, the setup, and I also like the confidence of it, and that's why I like the language so much. He was someone who knew exactly what he was doing, with his long sentences and then the short ones, and that was like the revelry and the opulence, and then suddenly something would pull them up short, and I thought that was very well done. That was the language and the sentence structure echoing the action. I thought that was really clever. I wouldn't give it any more than that because, as I said, I thought the end was just like it had to have something happen. I don't know if he was even as interested, to be honest.
You think his editor was on his shoulder saying, "You have to end it somehow"?
I think he was thinking he had to end it somehow, but maybe I'm assuming too much. Maybe I'm being unfair, but that was my feeling. But I thought, towards the beginning, it was as an experience, as an installation for the mind. Then I would give it 4.
Okay, and then last week, our listeners, we actually had a new listener come in, and I wanted to welcome her. Of course, I forgot to put the name, like an idiot.
Dylan Mora.
Yeah. Him. Thank you, Dylan. He came in and immediately had a great comment and jumped right into participating, and I really loved seeing that. How many Bradburys did the listeners give last week's story?
So last week we read Axolotl by Julio Cortázar, and they gave it a 5.5, 5.6. Yeah.
Woohoo! Okay.
Oh, wait, was this Todd's 6? Todd is one of our super fans, and I think this was his first 6.
Yeah, it was Todd's first 6. He really liked Axolotl. It's kind of a big deal when you get your first 6. It takes a lot to get a 6. I think everybody's had a 6 except you. I think, has your mom had a 6? I think she's had a 6.
I don't know.
I think she had one. I think you're the only one that's left, and you're picky. It's gonna be hard to find your 6. Okay, it's all on you.
On me.
Oh,
it's game time.
I guess, yeah, it is game time. We're going to choose next week's story. I'm hosting the game, but first, what did I do? I messed up something. Let me just cut this out. Tick, tick. Okay, Roz. Roz, if listeners would like to learn more about you and your novels, where would they find you?
The easiest place is rosmorris.wordpress.com, and they find signposts saying my books, who I am, and all that stuff.
Excellent. And now we're going to do the game. It's time to play the game. And so I have a question for you guys. What stories are you two submitting for next week's episode?
Shall I go first? Skeleton by Ray Bradbury.
Ooh.
And I'm submitting one that I've submitted before, but never won. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin.
The Ones Who Walk Away. Okay, so this story is in honor of Edgar Allan Poe because this is the second author who's known to be a cat person. And so this story, this game, I'm going to list authors, and you have to tell me, are they known for having a dog, having a cat, or having a bird? We're going to start with Roz, and we're just going to go back and forth, and then whoever gets the most points at the end wins.
Okay.
So, Roz, the first question is Mark Twain.
A bird.
A cat.
Oh.
This is going to be fun.
I would not have that either.
Elizabeth Barrett Browning.
Is that for me or for Anais?
Nope, it's for Anais.
Okay.
A bird.
Ooh, she had a Cocker Spaniel named Flesh.
Mm.
Oh, this is going to be harder than I thought.
Oh.
Yeah.
Roz, Charles Dickens.
A dog.
Ooh, this might be a problematic quiz. This was a bird. And in fact, this bird inspired a story that later inspired Edgar Allan Poe's Raven.
Oh.
Yeah, he
Gosh,
had a
you've done
raven
your
named Dreath.
research. You've done your research thoroughly.
I did. E.B. White.
A cat.
A dog. Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas.
Cats.
Dog. What am I gonna do if nobody gets a point?
You're going to run out of authors.
Murakami. Haruki Murakami.
Cat.
Woohoo! We got our first point.
I knew that one.
Dorothy Parker.
I'm trying to think hard. I don't want to lose this. Oh, a bird?
A dog named Misty.
Oh.
Jack Kerouac.
A dog.
Cat.
Really?
Yep. Flannery O'Connor.
A cat.
A peacock. The woman had a peacock. Yes, she had a peacock. I saw pictures. It was awesome. William S. Burroughs.
Shotgun?
A dog?
A cat. John Steinbeck.
He wrote The Red Pony, but that's not what you're asking, is it? Cat.
Dog. Big manly man with his big manly dog. Tennessee Williams.
Cat. Or bird.
You got that one.
Cat.
And I love
neurotic.
And this cat's name is Sabbath, which is really funny to me. Virginia Woolf.
Dog.
Woohoo!
Oh, I got a point.
Yes, you got a point. Dog named Pinky. Donna Tartt.
Bird.
A dog. And our last one, the last point. Well, unless you tie it. Raymond Chandler.
A dog.
A cat. So Annie's won this one. You finally got your story. How many times did you submit that thing?
Like 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, it took you a while. It's like Gerald trying to submit Hemingway over and over until he got us to read one.
I just want to read the book. Well, I've read novels, but a short story.
Totally. So, Anais, what are we reading next week?
So we're reading The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. Did you have strong personal feelings about this week's story, like any of us? Share them with us at literaryroadhouse.com. While you're at it, leave an iTunes review and let us know what you think about the podcast. Your reviews help us make the podcast a better experience for listeners like you. And as always, don't forget to tell your friends. Until next time, read a good story.
Woohoo!
Bye.
We're almost to 20 episodes. Thank you so much, Roz. You were a great